Well, good morning, and thank you for having me as one of your speakers today. I know that your time is very valuable to you, and I appreciate your attention for the next 15 minutes. I also appreciate the fact that we are, about an hour and a half before lunch, and if you read the book Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, you may have encountered the research where they found basically, as the morning wears on, people lose their ability to focus and make decisions. And this was corroborated when they found that for parole trials, basically, if you were first in the morning, you got out, and everyone after that kind of got stuck in prison. So if you find yourself dozing off or not paying attention, I totally understand. Just find me after lunch, and I'll tell you what I talked about now. My presentation today, I want to talk about sort of moving beyond just the question of cost when we consider open source for a number of reasons. But the key thing is I believe that just thinking about it in terms of a cost consideration really prevents you from really maximizing the value that you get out of open source. So I'll just start with the economics, and this is sort of the classical understanding of open source that we all have. We look at proprietary software, which is primarily a model based around charging you to get in. So you pay a lot of money, you acquire the software, and then there are some maintenance costs over time. So that picture kind of looks like this, and the license cost can be very prohibitive. It's a huge upfront cost. And a lot of what open source advocates have talked about is let's actually get rid of that, right? So a lot of us think about open source in these terms. You subscribe to some kind of a commercial open source model, and maybe you just pay for the subscription. There's no license fees. That's great. We can use the money for other things. Tariq mentioned that they saved, I think, 400,000 pounds on software. I'm sure a lot of that had to do with licensing, as well as the 10 million pounds that they saved over 5 years on another project. And this was a dominant argument, I would say, even like 5 years ago, even 3 years ago. Well, what's changed? I think starting in 2010, 2011, we started looking at a number of different ways to deliver IT services. And one of those was actually software as a service. And software as a service, I believe, proposes the same benefit economically that open source does, which is basically saying, we're not going to charge you a license to use the software. We have the software over here on our web-based, cloud-based service. You log in and you access the software. And basically, as long as you pay, you get to access the software. And for, I would say, 70 to 80% of folks who are considering open source, this might just be as good as using open source from an economic perspective. All you care about is, am I getting the value out of the IT service that I'm paying in? And I believe there's a correlation here. And on the other hand of the spectrum, when we go back to proprietary software vendors, what we've seen, so I work for an open source company, and we find that a lot of proprietary vendors are actually willing to discount their software. So it becomes kind of a moot argument, right? So I want to talk about why just thinking about cost is not the most important thing. And before I get into that, I just want to make this point, which is what I call the rogue developer impulse for open source. For those of you who have encountered open source advocates in your organization, they may have come to you with this argument, which is, look, it's free software. I can download it from the internet. I can start using it. And we can build that new government portal solution that you've been wanting to build for really low cost. And a lot of this comes back to, I think, a lot of developers, their impulse is they want to have control over the environment. They want to be sort of the hero, and they want to build this great solution. And open source gives them that chance to not only have zero acquisition costs, but also they can hack away at the code. They can make that software package into a highly customized solution, and then they also have job security because they're the ones who wrote it, right? So you're going to have to keep them around for the next 5 years to maintain the solution. And this is actually, it's good for the short term. It works for those first, 2 years or 3 years or 5 years. But what you'll find over time is that the cost of maintaining that solution can grow as well. And I think Tariq alluded to some of those concerns in his talk. So what should we think about open source? And what is the rationale for using it in a world where the IBMs and Oracles are going to give you those discounts, and we have other options like G-Cloud and SaaS, which can give you the same economic benefits? I think that a key part of this comes back to the fundamental identity of a proprietary software vendor versus an open source one. The proprietary software model is really reflective of a media company. So if you think about, let's say, a record label or a film company, they have huge upfront costs to produce their media, whether it's a movie or a record, but it's costs them very little to make copies of that. So if you work in a studio, you record the album, and you've got your master tapes, and basically you print a CD, it costs you next to nothing, but on the high street it costs you, 10 pounds, 16 pounds to get a copy of that. And if I understand the licensing agreements correctly, you don't actually even own that DVD, you're licensing it from the media company. And in the same way, a proprietary software vendor is in the business of licensing their intellectual property to you. And so it's a very one-way relationship, which I've shown here. Again, it costs Microsoft very little to package and sell additional copies of Windows. And so the mentality is, let's spend all this money up front to develop this software, and then let's lock up the IP and sell it to as many people as possible. And so you actually have a market, you have a field where you have a lot of locked up resources, right? So starting with the IP, but you also have different proprietary vendors spending massive amounts of money to develop software, and then passing those costs on basically to the customer, right? You've got different solutions that they're trying to, different problems that they're trying to solve. And again, money that's sort of siloed in their respective IT R&D budgets to solve those problems. There's no collaboration going on. They really have to protect that IP in order to be able to protect their business model. And there's also sort of an attitude of, we know what's best for you. With respect to that, so when you look at the product development process for a proprietary vendor, they may get some feedback from their customers and different industries that they work in, but product management functions as a black box. They make all the decisions, and then they push down new versions of software back to you. Open source in nature is actually quite different. So it's rooted in the concept of the commons. It's the idea that we have various interested parties, various stakeholders, trying to solve a common problem, and each of them has finite resources with which to solve them. And so open source, the spirit of it is, if we work together, if we work openly and collaboratively in order to solve this problem, could we not come up with a better solution than if we work separately? And so I refer to this as the curator-facilitator model, and this is really where open source vendors and open source organizations like the Eclipse Foundation see their role. It is not a one-way conversation, but rather it's two-way. You have the full range from passive users to full participants. You have contributors, either of code or of security fixes, bug reports, but also business knowledge. And this being a government conference, one of the key assets that you can bring to your open source community is your knowledge and understanding of the way that your industry works, the way that decisions get made in government, the particular dynamics of serving a constituency that isn't related to you in a sort of customer model, but is rather a political constituent, and how do all of those nuances basically affect the way that software should be built. Earlier today, there was a reference to how important it is to understand the end user and build solutions to make the end user happy. And a lot of what we see in open source communities is that desire to say, you understand your end users the best. Can you bring that knowledge back in and help us to build those solutions with you? Taking Liferay as an example, the problem that we're trying to solve collaboratively is what are the needs and features that are involved in developing a world-class portal platform that can serve many different functions across many different industries as a horizontal solution. And so we work with our customers and our community and our SI partners in order to solve this problem. But not only that, we would actually like to see an extension where we can also facilitate the creation of working groups solving different industry problems, for example, with government, or technical problems like big data. And of course, we can also facilitate the conversation across these different micro ecosystems as well. So what are the benefits of this approach? Open standards is referred to a lot, and it's part of the government ICT initiatives of 2011 here in the UK as well. I want to make a difference here, or make a differentiation between open standards from a proprietary perspective and then one from an open source perspective. There is a protocol called CMIS. It's the Content Management Interoperability Standard. And it's supported by open source vendors as well as proprietary vendors. So everyone from IBM to Documentum, Alfresco, as well as ourselves, Liferay, supports CMIS. But here's the difference. So if you are SharePoint, for example, and you implement CMIS, there's two ways you can do it. One is to allow your documents to be sucked out of SharePoint and into another system. And the other is to be able to read and to draw documents out of that third-party system into SharePoint. And for a proprietary vendor, basically, what they're going to implement is this one, right? So SharePoint can be your single point of access. You can suck all the documents out of all of these other systems into SharePoint, right? So that's advantageous for SharePoint. For open source vendors, you don't have that sort of barrier, right? So proprietary vendor can basically keep secret their implementation of how to read data in and out of their software, right? So whatever they expose to the world through an API or open standards, basically, okay, we've decided as a policy to make this available to you, but we're not going to make these other things available to you. And in the next version of software, they can change their minds, right? Open source vendors, we have no choice. You have the source, so you can figure out how we read data in and out. So for us to support open standards is not so much a sort of political or policy statement. It's really, by sheer fact of identity. We support open standards just because the source code itself is open. And clearly the standard part helps it, makes it easier for us then to interchange data and information. But in essence, we are open anyway. Okay, and then finally, I think there's a reference to a lot of the dynamics of working with SMEs, and a lot of open source vendors happen to be smaller entities. Liferay, ourselves, we're about 350 people around the globe, and here in the UK, we've got about 3 people. So clearly a different kind of dynamic, right? But as part of that, there is a tacit admission that we don't know what's best for you. And I referenced this earlier, but basically we do take this posture of saying we want to learn from you how to best support you and how to best create solutions that address your needs. Okay, hope you're still with me. So I think I've got about I'm almost out of time. Okay. So let me just go really quickly through how I believe you can get the most out of open source. First thing is spreading the word. It helps us as a vendor that as many people use the software, even for free as possible, because all of our services depend on the fact that there's as much scale in terms of use of the software as possible. So we actually want people to download. We want people to use the software as many places as possible because that basically increases our total value to the market. When we extend the use of Liferay throughout the government in UK, that means that the service providers, that means our own maintenance services increase in value. This is essentially about our business model, and that is to say that as the curator, facilitator of the plural platform piece of this endeavor, we think we're probably the best organization suited to support your software. So when you compare the cost of doing it yourself, remember the rogue developer scenario, or even having a third party, really think about economies of scale and how can we actually make the dollars or pounds that we spend go as far as possible. And we believe that we're going to provide that because of the sheer scale of the number of customers that we support. Put it very simply, if there's a fixed cost to maintaining Liferay over the years, we're going to split that up among all of our users. Here's another thing. So again, we've thought about open source in terms of lowering cost of acquisition, but then do we take a proprietary approach to our own projects? So imagine, there's the borough of Camden that's using Liferay. Maybe we could get Kensington and Chelsea to use it, but if they're all approaching their different problem solutions independently, that's a lot of wasted dollars. There's a lot of reinventing the wheel going on there. So if you think rather collaboratively about spending, I think it seems like there's already a lot of initiative around this. You can actually make that budget go farther. Now, architecturally, as a product, Liferay does support the ability to customize. So you can share 90% of your budget for all of the foundational elements that every government entity needs in each of these problem areas, and then reserve, some budget for the customization that you need for your particular scenario. The other part, in terms of participating in open source community, is maximizing budget. So if you use open source and then you go off and customize it, and you build some features, but you keep it behind your firewall, you keep it within your organization, you're really losing out on the whole point. You can basically end up in a situation, again, where each different organization is spending money developing the same feature. If you then contribute that IP back to the open source community, you actually allow the possibility that others can build on your investment. So you start off saying, we need this particular feature for our use case, but we're going to give it back to the Liferay community. And then let's say, some entity in Valencia in Spain actually fixes some bugs there, or they extend the capabilities. And this sort of collaborative development basically increases over time, so that even though you only spent, what's in the first dark blue box on the initial feature development, the total benefit that you will get over time is the combined budget of all four of these boxes. So I just want to end with an example of this in actual practice. Jorge Ferrer is currently our VP of Engineering, but he started as a member of the Liferay community. And back in 2002, Liferay didn't have any web content management features. And so using his particular business use case and his knowledge of Liferay, he developed those features and he gave it back to the Liferay community. And so what they were able to do is build a student portal where every view for each different grade level was different. So this was a view for someone in the first grade, this was for someone in the third grade, and so forth. Phenomenal feature. So that was back in 2002. Now it's 11 years later. What have people been able to do with it? Well, here's just a couple examples. Bugaboo, which is a famous stroller company based here in Europe, they're using Liferay's web content management features for their public website. Also, if you go to sesamestreet.org, they're running their public website on Liferay, but again, using those very features that were developed by the Madrid school system, 8 or 9 years ago. So imagine that all of this IP, all of this spending, all of this investment that's locked up in each of your individual organizations actually came together to address really the same problems that everyone's got. That's really the thing that will be very different from just saving money with open source or just saving money with the SaaS provider or something else. So I'm quite a bit over time. I look forward to your questions at the break. Thank you.